So hello, it's good to be here with you today. My name is John Cantwell. I'm Professor of International Business here at Rutgers University and a member of the Rutgers Business School. And I came here about 11 years ago from the UK, where I'd been a Professor of International Economics in the University of Reading in Britain. And at that time, back in Europe, I was at one point the President of the European International Business Academy. That's the leading body for international business researchers in Europe. But since moving here, I've served as the Programme Chair of the Academy of International Business. That's the main international association global association for international business researchers. We had our conference in Milan in 2008, and I was the Programme Chair at that time. And more recently, I've become the Editor-in-Chief since 2011, the Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of International Business Studies, which is the leading journal in our field. Academics from all over the world like to publish their work in our journal where they can, as it holds a relative degree of prestige to publish articles, and therefore we screen quite carefully and actually publish somewhat less than 5% of the total articles that we receive. So it's quite competitive to publish an article in our journal, especially as we receive many of the best papers anyway in our disciplinary area. Well, that's a little bit of background about who I am. Perhaps I'll now go on to talk on our topic today, which is China and emerging markets. And of course, these have become increasingly important in the international business arena. There's a lot of discussion here in America, for example, about outsourcing of production activity to other countries elsewhere in the world, and notably to China, which has entered also into the political debate here in terms of, does this mean the export of jobs from America, and what does this imply both for China and the United States? Well, part of the reason why American companies are going to China, and indeed companies from all over the world, is that it's a very fast-growing market. Growth in China tends to be about 8% these days. It has been as much as 10 or 11%, whereas of course in the more mature industrialized countries like America, growth is very much lower. That is to say, they've been decomposed into parts, sometimes known as modularization, but otherwise the fragmentation of production systems. And as production becomes fragmented into these different component parts of what we call a value chain, it becomes a global value chain or a global production network in which the different component parts of production become dispersed, geographically dispersed across space and connected through international business networking. This is particularly important for the emerging market economies. So we know that while global production systems have become very important in countries like America or many European countries, they've become even more important, relatively speaking, in countries such as China, where a large part of the expansion that has occurred, the growth rate I mentioned earlier, has been because of these global production connections and networks that are run through the auspices in part of multinational companies. What this essentially means is that very often outsourcing comprises initially some simpler assembly activity. So relocation of production is in part because of lower wages in a country such as China. But after a while, it becomes quite feasible for these new production facilities to upgrade what they do and to become themselves knowledge-creating nodes. And this has increasingly been happening in the Chinese case, which means that there are selected facilities that are actually very good at what they do and are contributing sometimes what is known as reverse innovation. That is to say, innovation that may be particularly aimed in the first instance at Chinese consumers, but also has relevance ultimately for the American system. For example, lower cost medical devices that are extremely useful in the Chinese context, but also obviously have relevance once they've been properly developed in an American context too. Another issue that's sometimes raised by these global production networks and outsourcing is, well, what about intellectual property rights? Aren't intellectual property rights relatively weaker in a place like China? And some research, for example, by Minyuan Zhao, the University of Michigan, has shown that in fact this is not necessarily the case. While certainly in pharmaceuticals, as an industry in which intellectual property rights, patents really matter a good deal for the protection of knowledge, there are other industries, some electrical systems, where knowledge is essentially complex in character. That is to say, no one component part of knowledge is adequate to construct an entire production system. And in this context, it may well be that the multinational firm is itself a kind of institutional form of protection for that intellectual property. So that even in a regime in which intellectual property rights are relatively weak, like in the Chinese case, one can still create new knowledge in a relatively secure fashion from an international business perspective, because it needs to be combined with knowledge from other parts and other connecting companies and nodes in the international system.